At the 2018 St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, an unprecedented summit took place on stage with some of the world's most powerful leaders in politics and finance taking questions directly from Bloomberg's top editor.
When we decide to rebuild, we need to be really careful as to the transparency and the actual impact.
Dialogue for the sake of the dialogue is pointless. Dialogue needs to lead to actions. Trust. It's either there or not. If there is no trust, then nothing good will come out of that.
Coming up, an hour of conversation from this presidential plenary panel. But first, the session's moderator, John Micklethwait, sets the scene.
Trust was the theme of this year's International Economic Forum in St. Petersburg, or perhaps the lack of it. With the prospect of a global trade war, with all the problems to do with Iran, with the issues to do with North Korea, there's not a lot of trust at the moment on the international stage. I'm John Micklethwait, the editor-in-chief of Bloomberg, and I came to St. Petersburg to sit down with Vladimir Putin of Russia, France's Emmanuel Macron, Shinzo Abe of Japan, Wang Qishan, the Vice President of China, and Christine Lagarde of the IMF to discuss these issues. I began by asking Vladimir Putin what he would do to salvage the Iran nuclear accord. We all know you want to keep the deal. You say you're a man of action. What actions will you take to keep the Iranian nuclear deal alive now?
The so-called Iranian nuclear deal has been established by a respective UN Security Council, and that is a multilateral international legal document. If we want our actions to be predictable, we need to adhere to the common rules. Any unilateral action leads into a dead end and is always counterproductive. That is why all of us together, all of the participants in this process, should speak to each other sincerely and look for a resolution. So yesterday we discussed this issue with President Macron, and an idea came to our mind. Every 4 years, presidential elections take place in the United States. So if international legal treaties and documents are being signed, and every 3 or 4, maximum 4 years, they're going to be rethought. So what will be the time frame for planning if one follows this particular regime? It's going to be 0, which will lead to an environment wrought with mistrust and nervousness. And so if we treat what we agree upon with true sincerity, that would lead to reliability and predictability.
During the previous sanctions regimes, Russia supported the sanctions against Iran, and you followed the rules. This time you disagree with what has happened. If the Americans impose sanctions on Iran selling oil, will you buy the oil, perhaps in exchange for wheat or something like that, and allow Iran to get round the deal?
It's a very simple question to me, because we don't buy oil at all. We produce and sell it ourselves. We are the biggest supplier of oil to the global market. But in as far as sanctions are concerned, Russia supported sanctions on Iran. The sanctions which were adopted by the Security Council of the United Nations, and never supported anything that has been forced by anybody unilaterally. And this is something that I has always been talking about. I believed it to be counterproductive and damaging and detrimental, and experts here as well as in the West may recall my speech in 2005 in Munich when I was speaking about impermissibility to attribute extraterritorial nature to the legal names forced by a single state, in that particular case the United States. And many took offense with me in the United States, in Europe, but that is exactly something that I was warning people about. And so now it is flourishing. Look at it. So here you are. The food is served.
That sounds to me like you would buy Iranian oil and help.
So if we are attentive in our analysis of what is taking place, and if we respond on a timely basis, there would be fewer problems like that. So we have been supporting, everything that has been produced by the global community in order to convince the Iranian counterparts to reach the well-known terms and agreements, and you should really commend them that they went to a lot of compromises, and they are very true to all of their commitments. Very recently, I met with the head of the International Atomic Agency, a very reputable organization and very respectful person who we all trust, and yet again he told me that based on the data that they have, Iran completely stands up to all of the commitments that they took. So what is it that we should punish them for? I don't understand it. So this is the first part. Now, the second thing is what may happen if this whole deal is devastated. Will it be beneficial to anyone? Will it be good for the global community, for the future of the regions? Will the regional countries, including Israel, feel safe? The country that we have very good relations with, and very recently Prime Minister Netanyahu came to Moscow, and moreover, he participated in the Victory Day events, and he held in his hand the photograph of one of the Second World War veterans and heroes when passing through the Red Square with us. That was a unique gesture demonstrating very credible, trustworthy relations between us. Is it going to be good for this country if Iran is pushed out of this treaty? Because the nuclear activities by Iran would be something that nobody will be able to understand. What kind of risks shall ensue from that? Look, we're not able to sort things out with Northern Korea because there's a problem upon a problem upon a problem. Nothing has been regulated. So do we want to now produce the second problem of the same nature? The hotspot of the kind of region that we remember it could be. So we should very calmly, in a very good-natured, professional way, maintain this dialogue and find a resolution. But as far as sanctions are concerned, I already mentioned it, we have always been supportive of the legitimate activities at the level of the UN Security Councils and never supported anything that is being unilaterally forced upon everybody else.
Coming up, more special coverage from the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. France's Emmanuel Macron discusses the challenges of staying on the same page with U.S. President Donald Trump.
There are things that really tie us very closely with the United States, specifically in as far as the foreign security is concerned. And I indeed enjoy these close relationships very much, but there are certain topics where we do not see eye to eye.
Welcome back to the presidential plenary of the 2018 St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, where 5 of the world's most influential leaders came together in a panel moderated by Bloomberg editor-in-chief John Micklethwait. The discussion turned to a 6th leader, U.S. President Donald Trump.
You tried to persuade Donald Trump to junk the Iran deal. You tried to persuade him not to quit the climate deal, not to start a trade war, not to move the embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. You tried to do all these things. You tried a softly approach, and it has not worked. Do you now think you should argue with Mr. Trump in a much harder way?
D'abord, je vous remercie de le constater et de le dire.
I made an attempt. I tried. I continuously worked on that because that is my responsibility, considering the level of confidence I have. And I believe that I would have been reprimanded if I wouldn't put all my energy into trying to avoid this particular outcome. And then I believe fully in the French foreign policy, which is based upon independence. I understand quite well that there are things that really tie us very closely with the United States, specifically in as far as the foreign security is concerned. And I indeed enjoy these close relationships very much, but there are certain topics where we do not see eye to eye with each other. We do not stick to the very same position all the time. There is also friendship, which evolved thanks to our history and to our past. But there are certain things as well that we disagree with. For example, as far as the climate agreement is concerned, I wasn't able to convince President Trump not to withdraw from because he made this promise during his election campaign, but I do believe that the collective mobilization whereby we try to push it forward together. And in this sense, I would like to extend my gratitude to China and President Xi Jinping, who immediately felt the need to act. And we were able to do it in such a way so that nobody else gave up on this agreement, and the speed of the ratification process speaks for it. So at the international level, President Trump simply lost out on this battle because he couldn't do anything, in a sense that nobody followed him in what he was trying to do. So we need to really uphold our commitments, and I may say that we are not yet reaching up to the level that we need to go up to because we're not sufficiently quickly reduce the CO2 emissions, but that is already our responsibility rather than the responsibility of the United States. Second point, Jerusalem. I openly stated that that was an erroneous decision. I don't think that we need to destabilize the situation in that region, which is relying upon very clearly set forth principle and certain balances. I naturally support the decision related to there being two states, because France has always been adhering to. One should never forget about the people living there, and we need to continue negotiations, and there have to be two states which would have its own capital cities, the borders which will be recognized and which could exist in peace. So the decision to move the embassy was not a very correct one, not very desirable decision. We do regret that this happened. We do remember the kind of events which occurred after the embassy was inaugurated in Jerusalem. And we understand that this has brought about a full escalation of various activities. Certainly, in this sense, Hamas is also should be held responsible. Therefore, I would like to welcome President Abbas's resolute decision. However, several dozens of people died because of the conflicts, the border conflict with Hamas involvement. And then I neither could convince President Trump with respect to Iran, but in any case, I tried to convince him. And I was standing by our position. I was saying that we've signed this treaty specifically within the multilateral framework. And I believe that this particular approach allowed for a certain openness, and President Trump acknowledged this openness. Here we're talking about the kind of openness whereby we can try and move towards a different set of terms in a treaty. And I believe that President Trump gave up on the 2015 treaty because it was signed by his predecessor. I mean, it was bad in his understanding by default. But now it seems to me that we are enjoying an all-round support, and we are setting up a coalition. And I believe that we will be able to set forth the kind of conditions whereby there won't be an improper escalation. And President Putin reminded us about it when he was speaking about the visit by the Israeli Prime Minister to Russia. And so now we need to further continue our discussion with Iran in order to convince the United States to gradually go back into the discussion, because we will slightly expand the framework, not because we're giving up on the Treaty of 2015, but because we are responding to a very legitimate concern on the part of Israel, Saudi Arabia, and to a larger extent, we are thinking about the need to stabilize the situation in the whole region. And so I believe that the kind of dialogue that I had with President Trump was very necessary, but it was also very useful because it enabled to open up this particular feature that enabled us to move forward. Of course, this is a very important effort related to try and convince. There is friendship on the one hand, there is an alliance on the other hand, which is necessary, and one we need to combat terrorism and in the security matters, and I shall continue this work because that is my duty.
Up next, Japan's Prime Minister and China's Vice President discuss North Korea and the potential for a breakthrough if a summit comes to pass.
China hopes for peace and stability in the Korean Peninsula. Under no circumstances should we allow a war.
Let's rejoin the presidential plenary of the 2018 St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, where the panel took up the topic of North Korea.
Prime Minister Abe and Vice President Wang Qishan, we have the issue of America, North Korea and the talks. Yesterday, Donald Trump said the talks were off. There are now some rumors where he says maybe they could come back on. I wanted to ask both of you who you thought was more to blame for the fact that the talks may not go ahead. Is it North Korea or is it Donald Trump for pulling back?
As for the summit between North Korea and the US, it was an event we were looking forward to. This is the task given in a UN Security Council resolution. The issue of WMDs, ballistic missiles, all these have to be effectively eliminated, and that was the main goal of a summit between the US and North Korea. And through holding such a summit, we should advance the resolution of these issues. And as I said when I talked, we, Japan and North Korea, have this issue of enforced disappearance. Many Japanese girls around 13 years old disappeared. They were kidnapped. And in 2002, Kim Jong-un recognized this fact, the fact of kidnapping of Japanese girls. And these issues have to be given a comprehensive resolution. Dialogue for the sake of the dialogue is pointless. Dialogue needs to lead to actions. And this was the path we were following. Yes, there were many issues. But as for a summit between North Korea and the US, I think in future we have to do everything so as to ensure such a summit between North Korea and the US. And to that end, the issues that have piled up have to be resolved. Kim Jong-un published a statement saying that he'll try to find an opportunity to organize such a summit between the two countries. Others should also pull their efforts together. Such countries as the permanent members of the UN Security Council, France, Russia, and the other members of the UN Security Council, all of them have to work together so as to implement the UN resolution to force North Korea to do that as well. The most important thing is to continue with our efforts. North Korea should be able to take concrete actions. And I do hope that concrete actions will be made by all the participants of the process, including by North Korea. As for sanctions, there is a trend at trying to find a way out of sanctions, to do that. And Japan is trying to counter that. I do hope we'll be able to prevail over these efforts.
Do you have an approach from China's side about an answer to this problem?
Before coming here, when I watched television and the internet, I saw some news saying that representatives of the Chinese Foreign Ministry have expressed the position of the Chinese government on the cancellation of a summit between North Korea and the US. Well, you asked this question, and I have to tell you that the nuclear issue of the Korean Peninsula has a bearing on China's core interests. China hopes for peace and stability in the Korean Peninsula. Under no circumstances should we allow a war or any clashes to happen in this peninsula. That is why we should promote the process of denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, and we adhere to a very determined, decisive position on that matter. Yes, yesterday I read some news. Despite the statement of President Trump or the statement of North Korea, both sides still leave some maneuver for a discussion. So I'm confident that peace and stability in the Korean Peninsula have to be maintained. And it's between North Korea and the US right now. And a summit is needed to achieve a breakthrough. I often believe that to achieve the best result, you've got to wait for a long time. But in order to settle this issue, I believe we have to be full of hope. And hope is about the theme of this forum.
Do you have any advice to the world in terms of how to deal with President Trump? Because you were somebody who was associated with the election of President Trump, and yet you look and see what has happened. There are many people here under sanctions. He has just withdrawn from the Iran deal. There are doubts about the North Korean deal. What do you think you have got from the relationship with him? The same question that I asked Mr. Macron.
Well, he's an agent provocateur. Well, certainly, we cannot be satisfied with the current level and the nature of the American-Russian relations. And we're willing to engage in this dialogue. Mr. Trump has suggested that a separate meeting should be held. So far, we didn't manage to work it out yet because many issues are popping up. But we are willing to have this conversation, a substantive one. I think it's high time we're engaged in that. We need a multilateral approach like that on many domains. Donald Trump has expressed a concern about a new arms race, and I concur with him fully. The measures that we are talking about in North Korea, Iran, they're not bringing us together, but that is another reason to talk about these matters. Emmanuel has said that Europe and the United States have mutual obligations. Europe is dependent on the US in terms of security, but one shouldn't be alarmed. We'll help. We'll help ensure the security. And in any case, we're going to do everything in our power so as to avoid any new threats. I think this is the avenue we should be pursuing. That's the first thing. Secondly, I'll enter sort of a discussion with President of France, who said that Donald Trump lost because he pulled out from the Iranian deal. I don't think he lost. First and foremost, he is just doing good on his electoral promises, and in that sense is a victor domestically. But should this deal be demolished for good, then many will stand to lose.
Straight ahead, frank talk about economic sanctions. Are they still effective?
The Russian economy is evidently stable, despite, triple or double shocks related to the price decline. So it all came upon us simultaneously, but we were able to persevere.
Welcome back to the presidential plenary of the 2018 St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. Building a trust economy was the central theme of the conference. Russia's Vladimir Putin and France's Emmanuel Macron engaged directly on the issue of how to foster trust, build cooperation, and maintain global security.
Je veux rassurer Vladimir, je n'ai pas peur.
Yes, I'd like to assure Vladimir that I'm not afraid at all, because France has armed forces that are fully capable of protecting the country, but I've got some obligations, commitments with regard to our European allies. I believe the current architecture of European security that I've just talked about is an area of our responsibility. Anyway, we're not going to turn our backs on one another, and we couldn't ensure security to the detriment of others, and that is how we should act, I think. I'm not afraid, and I'd like to express my responsibility and make good on it. Well, certainly, one shouldn't be afraid. But you see, the practice is there. We are talking about Iran all the same, but there was the practice of the U.S. sanctions used against European economic operators. We saw an example, 9 billion, I think, Paribas, French bank, Deutsche Bank, they were fined for breach of unilateral sanctions, and they had no choice but to pay up. And I think the same happened to Japanese bank. And this is something we have to put an end to, because that is unacceptable. That is what I'm talking about. And should this practice continue, nothing good will come out of it, because that undermines the current world order. We've got to agree with our American counterparts on some joint rules of game, because that is very important, because that's what underlies our current discussion, trust. That if it's either there or not, if there is no trust, then nothing good will come out of it. And as I said when I spoke, apart from the element of force, nothing will be left in international affairs, and that will result in tragedy. I share your point of view fully. Everything you said about financial issues and economic matters, there is no doubt about that. That is something I also spoke about. We've got to build a stable, a useful world order, and that will rest on multilateralism and sovereignty. And sovereignty presupposes respect for the interests of citizens and companies who are dependent on their country. And in that sense, we concur fully. And we have to have the necessary tools. And that is something we've got to reach an agreement with the U.S. And there's something I'd like to say. I wanted to ensure our sovereignty here, and all the decisions I made once I entered into office was to that end. And as for security, there is no suspicion there at all. We have common history. We have the collective system of defense and security that is very important for Europe and for the U.S. And I think that the mistake that was made over the last 2 decades consisted in the fact that through NATO, we did manage to make good on all the commitments that we undertook in the past. And that was not very just. And we didn't show enough trust which Russia could count. I have to tell you the truth here. That's why I've come here. Yes, in terms of financial, economic, sovereignty, trade and security, the EU, France and Russia have to build a new architecture which will help us advance in an atmosphere of trust.
President Putin, if you look around this room, you would seem to be evidence that sanctions do not work. Virtually everyone I meet here has been sanctioned in some way, and yet Russian business continues to thrive. Do sanctions still have any effect at all?
It's really not about the results of the so-called sanctions and restrictions being applied, and the fact that the people here who feel what it is, understand what it is, they encounter what this is, a prevalent majority of them is here because this sanctional club, this baton, is being applied more and more often, and not only with respect to Russia. Now, is it good or bad? Can it be overcome or not? Well, certainly. The Russian economy is evidently stable, despite, triple or double shocks related to the price decline on our traditional exports, staples, energy, metals, chemicals, the sanctional pressure on top of it. So it all came upon us simultaneously, but we were able to persevere and passed through it, and to a certain extent were able to strengthen our economy. And I'm very grateful to Christine. She specifically, described what should be considered a positive thing in the development of the Russian economy, i.e. the macroeconomic component.
I just would like to make one point, and it's certainly not for me to have an opinion on what is national security, and the leaders here are much better at that. But when we decide to rebuild, reorganize, redefine the architecture of the international order and the multilateralism, I think we need to be really careful as to the transparency and the actual impact, because while we are referring to decisions that have been made by Mr. Trump recently, the ambiguity that is embedded in the US national law system has actually affected many companies that are represented here. Even when the United States and its allies decided to lift the sanctions on Iran, many companies here in this room did not do business with Iran, or they used some very funny financial circuits involving some strange banks sometimes in order to do business with Iran, simply because the US legal system and judiciary system is such circumvoluted and obscure constructively for the US interest that there is no confidence, even though the sanctions had been lifted. So I think in rebuilding and redesigning, the actual impact at home, domestically, in the various countries that are party to those agreements really need to be clarified. And that applies to the sanctions that have been decided against some Russian individuals as well, where there is great uncertainty as to whether or not they are targeted themselves, their shareholding in companies, the companies themselves, some holdings, large territories of their corporate empire. So that is a real issue of confidence that is simply not there and needs to be addressed.
Coming up, coverage of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum continues on the topic of global trust and global trade.
We need to avoid any trade war because there won't be any winners in such a war.
You're watching the presidential plenary of the 2018 St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, moderated by Bloomberg editor-in-chief John Micklethwait, who asked IMF Managing Director Christine Lagarde about recent disputes over global trade.
The other side of the trade dispute, of the biggest trade dispute at the moment, is China.
Trade has been good to China, and trade has been good to many other countries as well in improving living standards, in lifting people out of poverty, and in acting as a driver for growth. And trade is a driver for growth around the world, and has been. Now, after 10 years of depressed growth and depressed trade, trade is finally picking up and finally growing faster than global growth. So it's really an imperative not just for China, but for all countries that rely on trade for their growth, to defend the international order in which trade is operated. Now, as I understand it, the complaint that the US has vis-à-vis China is of two different natures. One is China sells more than it buys from the US, and that is the bilateral trade deficit between the United States and China. It's a very strange way to look at the balancing act around the world. And one country should not look at one single deficit with another country, but its overall position vis-à-vis the rest of the world. That's how it really works. And it's, a strange complaint. The second side of the complaint of the United States is that in the trade game that is played by all, the allegation against China is that it does not respect the intellectual property rights. It forces transfers of technology when it accepts foreign direct investors in China. It subsidizes some of its state-owned enterprises. And according to the allegations, it is unfair trade practices that need to be investigated, looked into, and eventually sanctioned. And if that is true, well, there is a forum to debate those issues. And the WTO, to which China is a party, to which the United States is a party, which it was an original founder of, should be the forum where that is debated. And then it's a question of making sure that decisions made are effectively implemented by China.
Vice President Wang Qishan, I see you have applauded Mrs. Lagarde. Do you see?
He always does.
How do you see China approaching this dispute? Is this an area where America has got it completely wrong, or is there room for China to open up its markets?
But historically, I did some work as a deputy chairman of the State Council when I was overseeing the issues of our relationship with the United States. In as far as the trade war is concerned between China and US, between our two countries, at a very fast pace, very often we are holding consultations. And I believe that we must act in a reserved manner, and we should not be emotional about it. The China chairman, Xi Jinping, he once stated that China is not afraid of anything, but it doesn't make sense for China to provoke an incident. We believe that in any case we need to avoid any trade war because there won't be any winners in such a war, like the case was in the example of the war between England and France. 100 years it lasted for, but in the textbooks about history there's only one line describing it, which says that France took a great victory in that war. And the current world and mutual benefit or zero-sum game. This is a very serious matter, and the Chinese government has always been following the principles of mutual benefit, because that is something that will bring good to all of the peoples on the world.
Do you still think that China can learn from America, or do you think it has now passed it?
There are a lot of things that we can learn from America because America is the only global superpower. Despite the soft power or the hard power, they're still number one. This is the biggest developed country, and China, the biggest emerging country, the first economy and the second economy in terms of volume. And so we need to cooperate, and we know quite well about it. Without a single emotion, we should try to achieve the best possible results, but we should be ready to face any circumstances. And that is the wisdom of the philosophy of the Chinese people.
Still ahead, more from the presidential plenary of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. The 2018 St. Petersburg International Economic Forum brought world leaders face-to-face on stage. Moderator John Micklethwait concluded the presidential plenary by asking how Europe and Russia might establish more constructive cooperation.
You've come here to make your case on Iran, you've come here to make your case on other things. What is your view about what is the best way for Russia to rebuild its ties with the West?
We
need to maintain a continuous dialogue. We also need to do some good, fruitful work in the area of collective security, specifically as far as the Middle East is concerned. Yesterday, I believe that we have advanced ourselves quite well along such important issues like Iran to ensure that the 2015 agreement prevails and try to further work negotiating about it. With respect to Syria, we also undertook a joint humanitarian initiative, as well as we have agreed upon the way the mechanism existing between ourselves should further work. I mean, the Astana group and the so-called the smaller group, which was initiated by France several months ago with a number of permanent Security Council, UN Security Council members, UK, US, as well as Germany, as well as certain other regional nations such as Jordan and Egypt. And so we agreed to set up a coordination mechanism so as to be able to work within a single agenda, so as together work to put together a common roadmap in order to ensure a good future for Syria, to ensure peaceful sovereignty, and which would be an inclusive one in terms of the processes taking place in this country. And further on, we should together build our future in Europe in a geopolitical sense as well, because I presume that this is something that this depends upon our capability to resolve the Ukrainian crisis. And so, in as far as this matter is concerned, we've got the Minsk Accord, we have the Normandy format within which we're going to continue to act. Apart from that, we need to continue a strategic dialogue on the matters of security, cyberspace, and economics. And that is exactly what we've been busy with together. And we've envisaged a very specific action, because I'm sure that you noted that we've signed about 50 agreements in the economic strategic areas, very important ones, as well as in the area of the cyberspace. We also agreed to work together in order to develop and put together a single charter within which we'll be able to resolve different disputes. And that is a very important point, and strategically as well.
Can you see Russia being part of the European Union?
Je pense, il ne m'appartient pas ça de le dire. Moi, je suis
I think that one should be cautious about any possible expansion, because there used to be a bit of an euphoria on the part of the European Union. But when you are expanding without reforming anything, that really doesn't come out very effectively. So it seems to me that the European Union should be more sovereign, more unified, more democratic, and should understand what is its strategic priorities. So I believe that there is a bit of a centralized union which shares certain rules from the point of view of taxation, as well as from the point of view of labor regulation. But there is also another Europe which is somewhat in other regions, which is not part of this centralized nucleus. And in this sense, of course, Russia has a place in such Europe, and so I often think about the Russia's place in the Council of Europe, because the common space of law and values which identifies our countries as a broader Europe, I believe this is quite feasible, and I believe that certain work needs to be put into it. Reform is necessary on the part of the European Union, but on top of that, I believe that it's very important for us to enjoy very deep common strategic projects for the future years to come.
So Russia could end up in the same place as Britain?
Ça dépend de vous deux, si je puis utiliser cette plaisanterie.
That really depends upon the two of you. If you allow me to express this joke to you, dear John, there are certain points in history when fear may push one to make certain decisions. I do not think that we're doomed to that, but we do carry a lot of responsibility at the point in time when we here talk about it.
President Putin, what is your goal for Russia and the West? Where do you want to see Russia and the West? Despite all these misunderstandings, we could have gone through many other ones. Where do you actually want to take Russia? Do you want St. Petersburg, this place which is seen as the symbol of the Western capital of Russia? Can you imagine this again being integrated into Europe in the sort of way that Mr. Macron described?
Every nation has its national priorities and its own interests. And I spoke about it in the course of my presentation here, and we will certainly be striving to achieve our national interests now in terms of what they are today and for the foreseeable future, first and foremost in our internal development, because we need to provide for the growth of labor productivity in this country's economy. We need to create terms and conditions to attract investment, because without investments it would be impossible to resolve another problem. It would be impossible to diversify our economy. Madame Lagarde yesterday told me about it and also made a hint at that today as well. We've got 4.5% of growth of investment into the fixed capital last year, while the economic growth was 1.1%, which was a good indicator, an accelerated investment. But that is not enough, absolutely not enough. But in order for us to be able to attract capital from friendly companies and nations, we need to maintain good relations with Europe, with the rest of the world, with the United States as well. We're very well aware of this. But if we are to be forced into a choice, should we exist as a sovereign state or certain restrictions should be imposed upon us, we will certainly go for the first option. Because these substances which are put upon the scales are incompatible in existence of a nation or certain investments as a pittance of a sort. We are trying to achieve the kind of investments so as to bring back or establish the new rules of the games in the area of security and the international policy with the help of the currently existing institutions, which definitely should further evolve. But on that particular ground, we want to resolve the following matter: to diversify Russia's economy, to make it innovative. We want to work over artificial intellect and technology development. And actually, Christine expressed some concern over the robotics and the loss of employment. This is not so much fearful, I should say, although these kinds of phobias do exist and people fear this, and there is a danger of this. But as deemed by the international experts, only 5% of workplaces globally could be completely automated, and only 10% have already been automated out of what can be done right now. So there is a lot of room both for the Russian economy as well as the global economy. And upon this ground, we want to achieve the most important objective. We want to raise the level, the quality of our life. We want to reduce the number of people who live below the poverty line. We want to achieve the situation whereby the biggest performance indicator, the lifespan, should increase up to 78 years by 2024, and by 2030 for it to be 80 plus. This is everything feasible, but amongst other conditions, favorable external conditions are necessary, and we're going to do everything we can in order to achieve it without forgetting that, and that is also the point of our national interest, but at the same time, we cannot sacrifice our sovereignty and our fundamental interests. So I hope that this equilibrium between Russia and our partners will be found.
Can I ask you one final question, is who will win the World Cup?
The organizers will win, who at a respective level will organize this excellent festivity for the whole of the international community, for all of those who love this excellent international game. That is what we see as our ultimate objective, but in as far as the winning team is concerned, as they say, the strongest shall win. And I would very much like this to be a real celebration for all those who love the sports, both for the football players and for our guests. We will do everything for both the fans and the players to feel in Russia like home.
Thank you all very much. I'm sorry if I missed some of your own questions, but thank you.
And on my part, and on behalf of all my colleagues, I would like to express my gratitude to our moderator today, because I believe it was done in a very professional way. You've managed to really turn this discussion into a very lively, very interesting discussion. Thank you very much.